Hello, welcome everyone to the sustainability session at the Arab African Mining Conference. My name is Meg and I'll be your moderator for this session. I'm a sustainability designer at Business for Development, an organisation that works with the mining sector to design and implement community development programs that reduces rural poverty and lifts livelihoods around the world. Sustainability development and the call to action for businesses to act responsibly and contribute to society has been on the rise, especially since the outbreak of COVID-19. With mining being one of the strongest investors in the Arab and African region, the sector can play a significant role in achieving the SDGs. Now, we are very fortunate today to have representation from a number of industries that are working with the resource sector to drive sustainable development. Please welcome Nkuru Chemerulu, who is a Senior Manager for Global Operations at the UN Global Compact. Ignacio de Calenge is the Chief Investment Officer and Global Energy Minister in Mining at the International Finance Corporation. Aidan Davy is a Chief Operating Officer at the International Council of Mining and Minerals. And finally, we have Kate Southwell, who is the Vice President and Senior Legal Counsel at the Pilot Investments. So welcome everyone, thank you. So my first question is going to focus on the Sustainable Development Goals, or we'll call them the SDGs. The 2020 Responsible Mining Index recently released its assessment of mining companies, policies and practices on economic, environmental, social and governance issues. Nkuru, can you please share some examples of leading practice when mining companies go beyond the basic benchmarks and work to integrate the SDGs into their operations and strategies?
Yes, definitely. And thanks so much for the question. Just to kick off, because you mentioned the Responsible Mining Index, which was not necessarily a very rosy outcome report for the mining industry. I think obviously, there's a lot more that needs to be done in this particular industry when it comes to meeting what is even considered now sort of universally basic requirements when it comes to ESG, environmental, social, and governance considerations and compliance. But then when we also factor in the Sustainable Development Goals, which are much more complex, really quite far-reaching, very interconnected as well, it's clear that there's still a lot of work and a lot of progress that needs to be done. And maybe one sort of slight silver lining to that index report is that mining is not alone for every industry. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. But definitely when we think about it within the context of the Arab Africa region, where mining plays such a huge role in terms of economic development, but also indirectly human development as well. Obviously there's a lot of alignment and progress that needs to happen in terms of making more meaningful contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals. So when we think about leadership and leading practices towards the SDGs, because this is pretty much all we do at the UN Global Compact, we're the largest corporate sustainability initiative in the world. We work with thousands of companies in hundreds of countries around the world, really just focus on how can we get business to raise that level of ambition when it comes to addressing global, national, regional development priorities, but also the SDGs, which are representative of such. And we really feel that all business has a basic responsibility, at the very least, to sort of meet a certain threshold when it comes to respecting and supporting human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption. And that's the founding ethos of the organization. But when we think about what leadership is in terms of going above and beyond that, especially with regards to the SDGs and how companies can actually take a leading role in building that into their operations and strategies, I think a lot of it is really focused around that idea of integration, looking at integration not only of the SDGs themselves and how they are sort of integrated in each other and very interconnected. And I think any business that shows leadership or wants to take leadership will soon find out that you can't address one SDG without coming across and having to sort of meaningfully look at some of the core challenges that exist in other SDGs as well. But also looking at integration within the core business too. A lot of companies so far, and we've done a lot of research and reports and surveys across companies, many of which about 80% within the Global Compact alone have reported to taking some action on the SDGs, whether it's adopting specific SDGs or identifying or integrating the SDGs into their annual non-financial reporting or sustainability reporting. However, when you sort of dive a bit deeper and look more in depth in terms of the types of actions that companies are taking, you find it is very much still surface level at the cursory level, not really focusing on how to integrate sustainable development and align with sustainable development into their core businesses, practices, developing new business models that are aligned to the sustainable development goals, new products, new services as well. We do again find leadership practices, and I think the idea and what we do see is that the ceiling is always being raised. So what is considered a leading practice now is going to be considered standard practice 10, 15 years from now. But in terms of the sustainable development goals and the mining sector particularly, we find a lot of companies, and again, this isn't unique to the mining sector, this is pretty much across the board, regardless of whatever industry or sector you're in, the private sector, when looking at the SDGs, feel that their greatest contributions are to SDG 8, which is focused around decent work. So the role of private sector, the role of any business as a job creator, which absolutely is important. I think for the mining industry, when we look at SDG 8, and again, going back to what I was talking about around the integration of the SDGs, you really have to look at what are some of the barriers to job creation, to decent work, decent employment that happen, particularly in mining communities. Obviously, there's a huge role that large-scale mining companies play, not just directly as employers, but also in terms of sort of the indirect employment that they create within communities, whether it's through helping to advance different suppliers, through creating new food service industries, other services that feed into the mining industry. So looking at decent work, employment opportunities, SDG 8, it's really important to look at the procurement and supplier processes. We do see, for example, Anglo-American is a great example of what a leading practice for having strong supplier code of ethics and really trying to influence the SDGs through how you influence your supply chain as well. So Anglo-American has a very strong, dedicated, responsible sourcing policy and program that's aligned to global modern slavery regulations. They have training and clear communications for their suppliers with supplier code of conduct. And so, for now, that would be a leading practice. But I think increasingly we're seeing outside of the mining industry, more leading practices when it comes to responsible procurement. So looking at the role that you as a procurer can play when you can potentially support and promote marginalized groups, looking specifically at women-owned enterprises, youth-owned enterprises, enterprises owned in rural areas or areas that typically are out of reach or less connected to society. So the role in more targeted procurement as well. So setting up specific and ambitious targets to identify suppliers that are from marginalized groups, I think is sort of the next step in leadership that we would love to see more of within the mining industry as well. And then I think also, again, looking at the ecosystem within you exist. So leadership practices, again, you would have to look at what is sort of standard, and I would consider standard practice or basic practice to be examining what is operations that you are in directly control of. So operations within your sphere of influence, operations within your supply chain as well, and then going even beyond that, sort of if you look at it in terms of concentric circles, the largest stage would be operations within the larger ecosystem. So then looking at the ecosystem of decent work and employment within the region, the industry, the country where you operate, and how that's connected to other SDGs as well. So you can't talk about decent work without talking about poverty alleviation, without talking about inequality. Obviously, education has a huge role to play, as does gender as well. So again, leading practices would be something where you have companies that start to take these new lenses into consideration when devising policies, whether they're local content policies or trying to go beyond what the national regulations require of them. I think some good examples of that we've been seeing are definitely in the human rights and engagement space. And it was really encouraging to see that the UN guiding principles played such a huge role in the Responsible Mining Index report. And I saw a lot that was, in terms of their indicators, aligned to the UNGPs, as well as to the UN Global Compact 10 principles, which is also great to see. And so I think when thinking about human rights and all of the different human rights indicators that are embedded across several SDGs, the mining industry definitely has a role to play, and we are seeing a lot of improvements in that space, again, when it comes to community development, community interaction. So for example, Vale in Mozambique has some really interesting and innovative practices when it comes to engaging their local communities on human rights issues to ensure that the grievance mechanisms that they have in place are actually being used effectively, and they can ensure full dialogue and participation from all of the different groups, especially again from marginalized groups like women. I think in the mining industry, we definitely do see a lot of instances of gender-based violence. It is a very sort of masculine, to a certain degree, toxic masculinity within that industry in which women are negatively and disproportionately impacted as well. So recognizing, again, the different interconnections that could create barriers for them to be able to engage fully with the community and ensure that the human development aspect is being addressed in addition to the economic development aspect. And so as a result, they have taken some really interesting and innovative approaches in terms of how they communicate with local communities. So rather than going through intermediaries or local village elders, which sometimes, for example, will use their own biases to exclude certain people, they've used ideas like, for example, putting really important information on T-shirts and then distributing the T-shirts to people within the community, or posting it on billboards or signs to ensure that everybody that's just physically around within the community will be able to see it. Training women specifically as community organizers, recognizing that sometimes even when information is given in public forums, the forums may not be as public as you would want them to be, because sometimes they often will be implicitly gendered discussions in which women are not free to communicate. So again, I think in this space and looking at the way in which the mining community has learned through, I think, a lot of experiences and practices, the need to include this gendered lens into their human development approach has been really interesting. And we've seen a lot of great examples from that from different companies. I think also over the past year, due to the rise of gender-based violence across the world, but definitely in the Africa region, we've seen also mining companies step up in that space again. So a good example is AngloGold Ashanti here in South Africa, which is where I'm based. And they have very interesting programs that they do to support women in both in the community, but also in the workplace as well. So obviously in the workplace, it starts with training, awareness raising for employees, creating systems in place for effective and anonymous reporting mechanisms when you have incidences of harassment and violence. And again, I think that's considered a basic practice that all companies, if they aren't already doing that, should make sure that they are aspiring to that to close those gaps, but also going above and beyond that. So for example, AngloGold, they provide their unused workshops or warehouses, storage facilities that are not being used, and they provide them free of charge to NGOs to use as domestic shelters, to provide safe spaces where people that are leaving unsafe, hostile, violent homes or situations can go to. So again, I think it's about identifying the specific areas where you as a company can really make a difference, but also looking beyond just one specific SDG, looking at the issue as an entirety within the ecosystem, recognizing where things are connected and being able to then address those issues, not just by yourself, but also connecting with partners. In the environmental space, we're seeing a lot of that now with different mining companies that are partnering with governments or NGOs when it comes to environmental restoration for former mine lands and looking at how can they create potentially regenerative systems. Again, looking at what is kind of considered standard or good practice now and what we're looking at towards the future, which would be leading practice. I would say restoration is, sort of good practice in terms of what can mining companies do to ensure that they're conserving land, they're potentially offsetting some of the negative impacts that they have. There's a great example from Sumitomo, which is heavily invested in Madagascar in their nickel mining operations. And they have a business and biodiversity offsetting program, which they work in collaboration with the government to advance restoration of the land biodiversity. De Beers also has a great example of work that they're doing in one of their mines to utilize solar energy as well. So I think we're seeing some small sort of incremental innovations, but definitely leadership practice would be moving towards more of a circular system. So looking at how business within the mining community can develop circular operations to innovate new products from repurposed waste or byproducts, collaborate with different platforms to create second life for recycled metals, like from cell phones or from home appliances. AngloGold Ashanti Anglo-American in South Africa is looking into that now, and they're developing what they call a Revivify, I think it's called Revivify platform, which is a sort of online collaborative platform, which is meant to develop a second, third life for byproducts of mining waste and sort of the refining, smelting waste along the mining process, and looking at how they can collaborate with academia, with civil society, with other companies as well to create new life and really extend the life cycle of some of these waste products. So I'll stop here with some of these examples. Over time, I think I threw a lot of examples at you.
You did. There were brilliant examples of how in Africa, mining companies are responding to the SDGs and respectfully. So I'll move particularly to the workforce question, because mining companies do have a great opportunity to provide decent work. So I'm going to ask this question within 3 timestamps itself. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Aidan, considering your work at ICMM. So we're at the beginning of 2020. When you were looking at the year ahead, how did you see mining companies working to energize the local workforce and enhance human capital? And then COVID hit, and then this has been a huge impact on the world, specifically for mining companies. How has that changed as a result of COVID, and what's the new lens? And finally, the third timestamp I want to consider, how do you see mining companies working post-COVID to enhance and energize their workforce?
Thanks, Meg. I'll try and do justice to those 3 kind of connected parts of your question. But just starting with that first piece, our focus at the start of this year was to develop an aspirational skills training initiative to better enable host communities to prosper and thrive through some of the anticipated disruptions we see coming, and to deliver that over a 10 to 15-year time frame. I guess this most closely connects to SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, but to Nkira's point, they're all interconnected, and so it's also strongly connected to SDGs such as ending poverty, inequality, and good health and well-being. And we know that one key way that mining companies contribute to the development of host communities and countries is through providing jobs and helping to develop skills in the local workforce, although many companies also invest in human capital through education programs, enterprise development initiatives, and programs to build resilience. Now, over the years, there's been a major focus on how new technologies and ways of working will change mining, and the local benefits that can also deliver. It's difficult to estimate the likely impacts, but I know some studies have suggested that up to 70% of some roles at site may change or be made redundant in the automated or the digitized mine of the future. So I guess the question then is, what role should mining play in upskilling and reskilling when its contribution to human capital through direct employment is potentially going to be much lower? So we've been working with stakeholders and partners around the world to identify what role we could play in supporting communities local to our members to prosper and thrive through the disruptions we see coming associated with new technology. We were very much in the process of finalizing that at the start of this year, and then COVID-19 hit. I guess a couple of things to say about that. COVID-19 has accelerated trends already underway. The fact that we're now speaking virtually on this panel, in some respects, the future of work is already here. But the pandemic has also laid bare inequalities and vulnerabilities in societies and triggered conversations around rebuilding after the pandemic. And so for ICMM, we are progressing with what we call our Skills for Our Common Future initiative. And that aims to accelerate national and regional efforts to either build or strengthen skills to drive inclusive economic participation and diversification beyond mining, and thereby strengthen community resilience. Through the initiative, we also hope to build a shared understanding of the role that mining can play in recovering from the pandemic. Now, over the last 6 months, we've convened members who operate over 650 assets in more than 50 countries to share their emerging challenges and early lessons in their response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In dozens of video conference calls, the underlying questions that have come through have been really, how can we improve our immediate response? What comes next? And how can we prepare for that? So we recently published our Building Forward Better framework, which responds to these questions. It tries to capture the lessons, the case studies, the resources and the insights that have been shared by our members to provide a practical guide for mining companies, or indeed other companies, to review and strengthen their own COVID-19 responses. The framework very much encourages thinking about mining's role in supporting long-term community resilience post-COVID-19. It draws on industry experience to help users evaluate the challenges and opportunities for business to build forward better from the damage that's been wrought by the pandemic. And it looks to identify 3 key areas for action around lives, livelihoods, and learning. Lives very much being about health and safety, livelihoods around jobs and income, and learning all about education and skills. And so within those 3 areas, more than 90 actions that companies can take have been identified, illustrated with over 60 examples from across the mining sector. For example, one way that mining companies can help protect lives through their core business is an awareness campaign to inform and empower mining employees and communities on issues related to COVID-19 that's been run in South Africa by 4 gold mining operators. That's AngloGold Ashanti, Goldfields, Harmony, and Sibanye-Stillwater. Another is a public health support effort that Codelco and Antofagasta have provided in Chile by making facilities available for field hospitals. But then on the final part of your question, Meg, we may be working with COVID-19 for a while yet, but there's a number of steps individual companies can take to engage with and energize their own workforce now and into the post-COVID-19 future. I think the immediate task is to continue to protect the health and safety of employees, their families, and the host communities. That's been our priority from the outset. But beyond that, a number of possible actions are set out in the Building Forward framework. In terms of core business, companies can support upskilling out-of-work apprentices from across varied industries in automation to prepare for the world of work that's emerging now. Through their community investment programs, companies can support initiatives that bring together employers and education institutions to develop and scale skills training programs. And in the policy engagement space, companies can work across sectors to support digital inclusion, skills planning initiatives at a regional or a national level. And it goes without saying there's a gender dimension to this. You know, ironically, I think the transition towards greater automation and digitization will open up greater opportunities for a more equitable gender participation in the mining workforce of the future. And then finally, last point, consistent with SDG 17, collaboration and partnership will be critical between companies and training institutions or local governments or the multilateral financial institutions, or even between mining companies and other sectors. Let me stop there, though.
It's a lot to take in. It's a really interesting space. And yes, I do agree with you that we're going to be working under this COVID lens for some time now. But it's great that ICMM have put forward this paper, which enables other sectors and other mining companies around the world to learn from great examples. My next question under the sustainability session is with regards to responsible investment and government. So Ignacio, local governments always have limited funds available for a broad range of expenditures. How can mining companies best encourage these governments to direct their expenditure more towards SDG objectives in parallel to the mining companies' own SDG objectives?
Yeah, thanks, Meg. This is a delicate one because obviously, governments ideally represent, a democratic system and the people's choices in terms of what the priorities of a country or community are. So I think it is a very delicate one. I think from our perspective, there are a few things that a mining company should be doing. First is when deciding to go into a country, acknowledging or really looking at the country's obviously political system, transparency, and general management of its revenues. If only because that is a key risk for their business if that is not done in a proper way. So that's a first step is really the due diligence phase when going into a country. I suppose the second point is transparency. So what is obviously key for mining companies is to ensure there's sufficient transparency on both what the revenues are that are being given to a certain government or regional, national, but also ideally transparency around how those taxes and revenues are used. So I think there, again, the country's sort of adherence to EITI is an important sort of element of that. We, for example, at IFC require that companies, in addition to disclosing revenues, they disclose full contracts with governments so that there's full accountability around the contracts being paid, the contracts and the payments being done. We also encourage other initiatives to increase transparency. So IFC, we're working with BHP Foundation around the Development to Disclosure initiative, which is trying to see how we can increase the level of disclosure of revenues and their use, particularly with local communities, and sort of piloting that in a number of countries like Mongolia, Colombia, and Peru. So I think a mining company should really try to encourage that disclosure. Some of it it's within its control. Some of it can do in collaboration with other institutions such as ourselves or other institutions. And I think third is really one of partnership, and I think Guru referred to that previously. But seeing how, in partnership with local governments or regional governments, with NGOs, civil society, how they can really try to create a sort of comprehensive view of the SDG goals in their areas of operation. We've been exploring things with people like Pro Natura and Anglo in Peru around sort of these sort of a regional approach to the SDG goals, and for that, obviously, local government and national governments are key to have in that dialogue. We're also and have been working for quite a while, again going back to Peru as an example, on building capacity with municipal governments on how they use the funds that they get from the Cañón Minero, and really build the capacity to prioritize and budget. And so I think mining companies, while I think it's delicate for them to do that directly, and frankly, I think it's probably advisable for them not to do it directly, they can partner with institutions that can facilitate that, build capacity at the local government level in particular, or even at the regional government level, and ensure that those funds and those taxes and royalties are used in the best possible way from an SDG perspective.
And Nkuru, I believe you wanted to make some points with regards to this. What are your thoughts on mining companies working collaboratively with governments in aligning to national SDG action plans? And I have to say, I've got 2 minutes for you to answer this question. I'm just conscious of time, if that's okay.
No worries, I'll keep the time this time. But really, a lot of it is just to echo or complement, rather, a lot of what Ignacio said in terms of partnerships. And I think there already are existing and pretty well-functioning mechanisms that offer opportunities for business to play a stronger role in helping to align and also advance a lot of the national development priorities that governments have. Since the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, almost all governments have set national SDG action plans. Definitely some are more detailed than others, but it's pretty comprehensive across the board in terms of the scope of countries that have set action plans for the SDGs, in which they identify what their specific priority SDGs are. And so I think that's really one key and very clear way for business to play a key role, particularly companies in the mining industry in countries where mining does play a huge role when it comes to economic development, to identify what are the national development priorities and be able to pool their resources to advance those goals as well. I think whenever you have a shared goal objective, it's much easier to get to those goals and targets than whether you're working alone. So of course, again, bringing up this idea of partnerships. but also recognizing that a lot of strategic planning when it comes to the SDGs and sustainable development is already happening. And I think business is a very welcome and much needed partner. And it's simply a lot of times the issue is just information asymmetries of business not being aware that governments are doing certain things on the SDGs or vice versa. And so really, whenever possible, to bring business into these platforms that are existing in the UN through what is called the Voluntary National Review, which annual process in which countries report on their progress on the SDGs and identify how they're doing on their priority SDGs. Also, at the country level, the UN process goes through a very comprehensive strategic development assistance framework, which is essentially sort of a 5 to 6 year SDG strategy plan, which definitely has a role for business to play. So again, I think there's a lot more awareness raising that needs to be done on the government and UN side to make business aware of some of these processes that are going on, to bring them to the table, to better align and also better support these efforts that are happening.
Great. I do have a question for yourself, Ignacio, from the system. Ignacio, can you elaborate on mining disclosure? How can mining companies elaborate on their disclosure process? I've been asked by a member.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I think that the point is ensuring that there is disclosure in terms of the revenue, the taxes and royalties paid to governments, and to which level of government. Obviously, different mining codes have different sort of rules in terms of where the money goes. So, at a very minimum, they should be doing that on an annual basis. In addition, ideally to the actual mining license, and if not already disclosed, should be disclosed so that people can actually see the full terms of that. I mean, obviously, in terms of their own sort of activities, I think mining companies have improved a lot the level of detail of their sustainability reports and their the sort of level of disclosure around that. So I think that there's good progress from that perspective as well.
Great, thank you. Our next question is with regards to investment. Kate, Parla is an investment company dedicated to value creation in the mining sector. Can you provide some insight on how investors review potential investments? Shh, it's going to get the cat.
Absolutely, Meg, thank you. So it's very interesting to be on a panel with such distinguished and knowledgeable co-panelists. I'm obviously here to share a bit of a different perspective, which is the investor perspective. And like many investors, we've been following this space for a while. I guess a bit of background on Parla. Parla is an investment company, a private company based in Switzerland that does focus exclusively on the mining space. And historically, we've done a lot of investments in Africa as well as around the world geographically. I'd say we are a very conscious and responsible investor in that when we say we're creating value, we're looking to create value for all stakeholders in the projects that we're involved in. And the other main point around Parla is that at the moment, one of our key thematics is the transition to a cleaner and greener energy system. And I think that that's relevant for a number of the SDGs, in particular, I guess 7 on clean energy and 9 on industry and materials, because we see tremendous amount of investment pouring into the sector to drive this transition to the decarbonisation, particularly when government stimuluses are, expressing that millions, if not billions of dollars are pouring into this space, and the infrastructure required to support this transition, including in things like battery storage, will require a tremendous amount of minerals and materials. So we see that as a real opportunity as an investor. I guess particularly from the due diligence process perspective, we would pre-screen all our investments to make sure that they didn't flag any of the major risks that Ignacio mentioned, particularly in a jurisdictional perspective. We need to make sure the rule of law is strong and that we have confidence if we invest, we can take security and understand the legal structure that we'd be operating in. But obviously, we also need to make sure that from a commodity perspective, from a portfolio perspective, it fits within our investments. And I think the way that the SDGs are now informing a number of investors, including ourselves, is that it's not a box ticking exercise. And this touches on a lot of the themes that Nkiru mentioned. You can't just sort of tick these off and say, well, they're good at 1 and 2 and not so good at the others or whatever. It is a holistic exercise now, and it really points to good risk management. When we look at companies, there are companies that are differentiating themselves by understanding how these SDGs are integrated into their business as a whole, and how they will impact and affect the sustainability of the business going forward. And those are the kind of businesses that we want to invest in, the ones that we see have real potential for either growth or some kind of improvement within the sector that they're in. And so I think from a risk management perspective, the other one to really focus on is whether or not the management are skilled and experienced and competent, and also have experience in the specific country. And we'll be looking at the board, the composition of the board, and making sure from a governance perspective, they have the right skills, that they're incentivized, aligned with the management. And again, that all kind of wraps into the strategy of the company to consider these issues that we're talking about today, whether it's the environmental impact of the sector or, the health and safety of the employees. All of these are intrinsically wrapped up into how we make our investment decisions. So we do feel like the investment universe is starting to really be differentiated between those companies. And I have to say it's big and small. There are some smaller mining companies that are very, very good at least understanding where they want to be, even if they're not quite there yet, which I think is the point of a number of these reports. But I would agree with all the comments that there's a long way to go for us to really see a genuine improvement and understanding of how to implement the SDGs into long-term sustainable business planning.
Absolutely. So there is a long way to go, but we're on the right path, I feel like, moving in the right direction, although COVID has produced a bit of a hump to the sector. But as long as investment still requires these type of, I think that will drive the SDGs and incorporation of all the SDGs into how a mine does operate. Now we're going to move to ESG, so environment, social and governance. Ignacio, when we talk about ESG for private and listed investments, what does this actually mean? And is private included, or do they kind of get a leave pass?
Well, no, they certainly don't get a leave pass. I mean, I think as Kate says, this is at the forefront nowadays of investors' sort of concerns, both in terms of the do no harm. We have seen in recent sort of weeks very notable examples of cases that when things go wrong, it had serious consequences for a company in terms of potentially management and also sort of investor appetite. So I think, and we've seen a few other sort of notable examples of major issues going wrong in mining projects, which had serious consequences, financial consequences. So I think it's definitely significant in terms of do no harm, but it's also becoming more and more significant in terms of the sort of more positive aspect of it, so the sort of beyond compliance, if you will. I think we're seeing increasing pools of capital that are either dedicated to green and sustainable purposes, or at a very minimum are incorporating ESG criteria much more thoroughly into the investment decision. So as those pools of capital continue to increase as a percentage of overall capital, you're going to have additional pressure there, not only to not do any harm, but actually being seen to actively contribute to SDG and beyond, to general positive sort of ESG governance and the like. So I think it's very much both the boards and the management of companies, private companies, listed companies. It is a focal point right now. I think, as we've just discussed, the key question is how to operationalize that and embed it. Some of the issues we've seen recently is not because the management or the boards of the companies don't believe in ESG or I think it is more a question of it is not being fully integrated into operations, finance, and the other functions of companies. And that is, I think, the key next step to make it real and fully integrated. One of the things that we're looking at, for example, is to and this is something that is coming a lot to the fore, are green financing, SDG linked financing. So these are financings that very specifically link ESG or green environmental SDG targets to a company's financing strategy. And the beauty of that is that it helps to integrate functions. ESG or SDG issues have been sometimes left to the PR, the communications sort of area, or sort of the fringe areas of businesses. By doing green or SDG financings, you're thoroughly integrating ESG compliance and SDG sort of targets into the financing function. And when there's money and there's consequences on your borrowing costs, very direct consequences of borrowing costs, that helps to focus the mind not only of your ESG team, but also of your finance team and your operational team. So I think we're slowly getting there, but it is a journey.
Absolutely. I've seen, having worked in the space for 15 years now, there is a significant shift beyond the PR communications side of ESG and sustainable development. And more of the accountants are requesting results beyond a ticking box in order to demonstrate impact there. Now, how does Parla as an investor consider ESG, Kate, and the factors and the SDGs when considering making initial investments yourselves?
Yeah, so as we've touched on, it is obviously a very fundamental part of our due diligence process. What's interesting is in some ways, before we started calling it ESG, a lot of these things were being obviously looked at before. And for example, the social license to operate has been, on the radar of pretty much everyone for a long time, because that's pretty much the only way you can build a successful project and operate it. Having said that, I think having a framework such as an ESG, list of criteria does enable you to make sure that you're really doing a comprehensive analysis of the company, looking at it from many different angles. From a technical perspective, we would always do a very thorough environmental assessment and make sure that all the licenses, etc., are there. That's pretty basic. I think on the social level, that particularly in a post-COVID world is becoming a more complex review, understanding, what are the labor issues, the health and safety issues, the community issues that you will need to manage to be able to operate successfully. And then from a governance perspective, we have touched on it, but I think what's absolutely crucial for every mining company and every project is competent management and management with integrity. I would say management who believe in these issues and believe in the need not just to pay lip service to them, but also to actually be driving them forward and using initiatives and real enthusiasm to make changes. And just to reiterate what Ignacio says, I think there's a couple of different angles to how the ESG lens is impacting financing of projects. But I think there's a general consensus that companies with better ESG ratings, whatever you want to call as a rating, a subjective ratings or otherwise, will have a lower cost of capital. So that's a pretty fundamental, driver to whether or not you're going to choose to invest in that project or not. Secondly, there's this sort of direct trend that is linking loan covenants to environmental or climate change or whatever other criteria you want to link them to. But I think that will be very successful because, as you say, there's nothing like focusing the attention of believing that your interest rate's about to ratchet up 2% if you miss a hurdle. And then finally, I think we've seen a number of companies link ESG criteria to CEO remuneration and making sure that from the top down, the company is behaving responsibly. And again, that's a very powerful way of making sure that this stays at the top of the agenda for both management and the board, is tying compensation to the successful achievement of these type of goals. So I'd hope to see more of that in the future as an investor, because as we say, I think it drives a lower cost of capital, it just drives better decision making and better risk management, and ultimately will hopefully focus people's attention on these matters, as well as all the other complex operational matters people are dealing with this year. We really do need to focus on these as a priority as well.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, I want to go back because I was running out of time, but we actually do have time now. I wanted to go back to Aidan with regards to the government question, because I felt he might have some interesting perspective on how mining companies can engage national governments that they're working in to align their own SDGs with a mining company's SDGs. Aidan, did you want to make some points on that?
Yeah, maybe very briefly, because I think it was very well covered by both Ignacio and by Nkiru. But I guess just to echo Ignacio's point that it's sometimes an uncomfortable space for companies to engage with their host government on how that government should wisely use their resources. But I think this is where there really is strength in numbers. So if you're operating in one of the 54 countries that are members of the EITI, and participation in the EITI has been an ICMM membership requirement for well over a decade now. And that includes many countries in Middle East and Northern Africa and in Sub-Saharan Africa. I would strongly encourage companies to actively engage in the multi-stakeholder groups in their countries of operation. And these multi-stakeholder groups, which are kind of at the heart of the ITI implementation in country, they are a great forum where you can join with other stakeholders in legitimately encouraging governments to more directly and transparently direct resource revenues towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals.
No, absolutely, totally agree. The more you can work with, the more you're able to make the changes required in the marketplace, definitely. So our last question is with regards to, it's quite an interesting one, mining and social responsible investment. Does the sector risk becoming an investment wilderness? Investment wilderness is a very big question. Aidan, as the CEO of ICMM, how would you describe investment wilderness, and are mining companies in the social responsible investment space locking themselves out of this capital?
So thanks, Meg. Investment wilderness, it's not a term that I'm familiar with, and wilderness to me has really positive connotations of open space and biodiversity and escape, which I think is much needed in the current climate. But look, I assume that the question implies that mining would become uninvestable to socially responsible investors. I don't see the sector becoming an investment wilderness. Numerous studies, including a number that have been funded by the UN, indicate that the realization of the SDGs is going to be metals and minerals intensive. And that's on climate action, on clean and affordable energy, clean water, sustainable cities, industry innovation and infrastructure, and others. But while the products of mining have an important role in delivering on the promise of the SDGs, what I expect we will see is greater differentiation on the part of investors between companies that are regarded as investable on the basis that they subscribe to high ESG standards and those that are not investable. We gave a great deal of thought to this question, of this issue, when we developed our strengthened ICMM membership requirements, our mining principles, which were launched in February of this year. ICMM mining principles define good practice ESG requirements for the mining industry through a comprehensive set of 38 performance expectations. And through this, we seek to maximize the industry's benefit to host communities and minimize negative impacts on issues of concern to society. In part, they respond to demands from investors, customers, and other stakeholders that critically important raw materials should be produced responsibly. They also map very well to almost all the SDGs, and we've undertaken that exercise before they were finalized. Now, the mining principles include clear and really specific requirements that members are expected to conform to. Just to look at two of them, for example, principles 3 and 9 cover the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, labor rights, resettlement, indigenous peoples, gender and diversity, community well-being, economic opportunity, and access to grievance mechanisms. Now, up until now, the main vehicle for members to demonstrate their commitment has been their annual sustainability reports, but that provides a corporate level aggregated view of performance. What's changed is that the mining principles will apply to the asset level, and the disclosures that members have committed to will give investors, customers, and other interested stakeholders line of sight to performance across all applicable performance expectations right down to the asset level, then in addition, members will have to undertake robust site-level validation of their implementation of the performance expectations, and the outcomes of this will also be disclosed. So I guess my view is that by adopting higher standards of ESG performance, by transparently reporting progress on implementation, and being really upfront with investors, that will enable relative performance to be differentiated, and more responsible mining companies can remain investable to socially responsible investors.
So I'm just writing down, sorry. I've got a question back to the ESG that's come through. ESG considerations are often associated with box ticking exercises. Kate mentioned investments with a high ESG score are associated with a lower cost of capital. How can the sector move beyond ESG considerations towards an impact investment decision process? Many institutions will allocate capital to natural resources companies with good ESG scores, but rank poorly on impact. Kate, do you want to attempt to answer that question?
I can try, but I think Ignacio can probably speak to it better. I mean, it's a very good point, and it's interesting because I've actually seen some mining projects rebrand themselves as impact investment projects, and those are mining companies that feel that they have a very strong positive impact on both the local community that they're operating in, the national country they're operating in, and sort of worldwide generally. They tend to be companies that are operating in, for example, the lithium space, so they can say that they're part of the EV and the battery mineral supply chain. So whether or not all companies can sort of rebrand themselves as impact projects, I'm not sure, because I don't believe that there is yet, a very concrete objective test as to how to how to measure the impact of a specific project or a specific mine. But I would say that that is perhaps the step beyond ESG that companies should aspire to. And maybe I'll hand over to Ignacio to speak a bit more about how he could assess the impact of various projects.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So, as IFC, we're doing a lot of work generally on sort of helping to harmonise impact investing principles, but across different industries. I think, in particular, around the mining industry. Again, I think we're seeing some mining companies articulate much better and track much better goals and objectives around impact related to SDG goals. I mean, again, Anglo-American is for me a good case in point, with both long-term goals and ambitious goals on a number of impact measurements related to different, education, community, etc., etc. I think so. I think it really is for mining industries to set ambitious goals in medium to long term, be transparent in tracking them, as Aidan sort of said, and also potentially financial innovation around that. So we're seeing a lot of financial innovation around SDG linked financings, and typically it's been you increase the interest rate if they don't meet the SDG loans, but we're seeing much more innovation around that, where investors are saying, well, maybe there's a different way of doing it to ensure the impact is being done. So instead of just increasing the interest rate, if the goal isn't met, maybe that additional cost, additional money goes into certain programs which actually have a direct impact on the SDG facility. So it's not the investor who gets the additional interest rate, it's actually the communities that benefit because that SDG target hasn't been met. So there's a lot of thinking around how can we actually make it very tangible, well, obviously trackable KPIs, tangible and transparent. So I think all that space is opening up more possibilities for impact investors to really look at the mining industry in a very sort of serious way, and be attracted by it. I mean, it's there's always a perception issue around mining, I think there is room to work around these impact investors and attracting them to the space.
Meg, maybe if I could just come in on this one as well. You know, I couldn't agree more with both Kate and Ignacio. You know, I think it's generally accepted there's three attributes that distinguish impact investing from other forms of investment. Firstly, it's the intent to get those environmental or social outcomes alongside your financial returns with clearly defined beneficiaries. Secondly, it's the financial or non-financial contribution plus a credible narrative of how you're going to achieve the outcome you're aiming for. And then lastly, measurement to link intent and contribution to the outcomes that you've desired. Clearly, ESG issues are increasingly important for investors, but do they really apply an impact lens to their mining investments? I think the answer is rarely. And when it comes to equity and fixed income investments in mining by large institutional investors, you know, that I think is a missed opportunity, because neither the ESG research agencies nor investors give much, if any, credit to mining companies that create positive social value through their investments. I guess the rating agencies see ESG risk as inherently negative. Investors see the creation of social value, which can include environmental protection, as a useful risk mitigation strategy, but they are much less likely to give credit to positive social or environmental value creation. And again, I just think, given the extraordinary potential for mining to create social value, this strikes me as a real oversight and an opportunity space as well.
We have a question. We've spoken about loans being increased percent-wise unless they meet certain SDG or ESG requirements. And the question is, are there any other sanctions, penalties, measures set at the UN level or other organisations for mining companies not being compliant with ESG requirements? This person gives an example. In Guinea, for example, there are many complaints raised by NGOs and local communities about the damages caused by the environment due to non-compliant exploitation standards. I think just being non-compliant. Other than interest rates being increased, where have you seen sanctions, penalties, or measures being made? Maybe from a UN perspective, we could hear some thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. And this might be a frustrating answer, just because obviously the UN being an intragovernmental organization, the role that it plays as a sanctioning body is not particularly robust, just given the framework and the processes and the fact that it essentially, is made up of all of the member states. And so I think that provides a lot of political considerations in terms of how the UN operates. There definitely have been situations in the past where there have been egregious human rights abuses or abuses against, core principles of the United Nations, where the UN has taken on a role to sanction. But of course, that is always done through a specific process that's, very long and complicated, and I won't go into here. But when it comes to business engagement, I think there are a lot of different mechanisms, and a lot of times the UN is more focused on the prevention side. So really, how can we create strong institutional systems within, at the country level, at the local level, to embolden and empower the local institutions to be able to play a strong role in terms of providing governance mechanisms as well. So civil society has a huge role to play in that. And the UN, through a lot of the work that it does in various platforms and agencies, works very closely with civil society to build a strong civil society in the government, because that's really, or in the country, because that's really needed for good governance, and especially the role that civil society can play as a watchdog for business. So really informing civil society, for example, around the role that business has to play when it comes to human rights. So they have a clear understanding to be able to articulate what the actual issues are, creating platforms for dialogue mechanisms, grievance mechanisms between business and civil society, other watchdog groups, to be able to address these issues at the local level. Because I think a lot of times the expectation is that the best mechanism or the best, solution to an issue is to go through some kind of legislative process, but those can often be very long, very onerous, and not necessarily lead to the outcomes that you want. And so a lot of times I think you have to look for more, in certain cases, informal processes to come about a resolution that meets the needs of all those involved. And again, I think a lot of it goes to education, again, not just on the civil society side, but also on the business side to handle these issues as well. Because I think when it comes to grievance mechanisms and dealing with local communities, you find even for some of the large scale mining companies, they have different processes depending on where they operate and where they work. So it's really about aligning and creating a system and a process that's most effective.
Does anyone else want to
add, just to clarify, when IFC finances, if a company is not in compliance with international environmental social standards and IFC's performance standards in particular, we have the option to actually ask the company to repay the full loan. So it is not just an increase in interest rate. The increase in interest rate is when they don't meet some voluntary beyond compliance targets. If they don't even meet compliance, we actually call back the loan. And in addition to what IFC does and other development finance institutions, IFC also created or co-founded the Equator Principles that 110 of the major sort of international banks adhere to. And under those Equator Principles, they also have similar policies. So apart from what Kuru was referring to in terms of local sort of enforcement of local environmental social laws and building capacity around that, financial institutions such as IFC, but also the commercial banks, also have a role to play to at least make sure that where they invest their money, rules are being adhered to. So there is some level of enforcement at that level as well.
Would anyone else like to add some comments to that, or shall I just wrap up the...
Just also to add quickly, just because Ignacio's comments also triggered something else, but also the role of the UN as a procurer itself. And in certain countries like Afghanistan, Kenya, Ethiopia, where they have a large presence, the UN plays a huge role in terms of being able to stimulate local economies. So definitely through its role in its supply chain and as a procurer, the UN definitely has very high integrity standards in terms of business operations, responsible business. And so if you are on a sanctioned list or a list of vendors that the UN does not work with, I think that definitely has a lot to do in terms of playing a huge role in incentivizing and disincentivizing certain practices and behaviors as well. So I think, again, not always looking through, sanctioning processes or legislative processes, and also looking at other influential levers that organizations like the UN can play to incentivize and really direct responsible business practices.
Fantastic. Well, then I'll just summarize what we've been speaking about today. I came across a concept called the say-do gap a couple of months ago, when an organization says what they say and then they actually do. And as a result, by actually having alignment, you're going to create more trust. So we have about 80% of mining companies saying they're going to commit or do a lot of ESG work, but actually need to go to the next step in terms of implementation and having on-the-ground impact. We've had some great examples from Anglo-American and their social way to engaging women, youth and rural communities, using their supply chain and human rights, also applying a gender lens in order to enable more communities to have more participation, but also in response to COVID in terms of human rights and violence and et cetera like that. And we've seen some great work by the mining sector in terms of environment. So there's a lot of progress that's been made, but is it enough? There's certainly more opportunities. And we're seeing through COVID-19, a lot of mining companies have been stepping up to this. Investment certainly has an impact on how mining companies do respond. And through things, for example, such as I would say what IFC and the Equator Principles are doing are driving the mining companies to change the way they approach how they operate in a market, in the community and in the country. And this is great to see. Although it is difficult to often work in some interesting countries in the world, having strong due diligence when you approach a country, engaging more organizations when you're in country, for example, from NGOs to institutions, multi-stakeholder groups, you're going to have strength in numbers in engaging to achieve more SDG outcomes in country and meet your own objectives as an organization itself. So there's some really interesting opportunities there. But finance is always going to hit hard. So as we see, there's really great opportunities to align the world's finances to responsible investment. And it's great to see what IFC is doing and Parlo Investment is doing to achieve greater outcomes on the ground and around the world. I hope everyone enjoyed the session today. I really enjoyed meeting all of you. And I look forward to meeting you in the future and to talking about sustainable development and working in partnership to achieve greater outcomes. Thank you.